All right, good afternoon. I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. I think a few more guests will be arriving and getting lunch and joining us as we roll into the talk and discussion this afternoon. So first of all, let me welcome all of you. My name is Peter Mandeville. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And on behalf of our director, Sean Casey, and managing director, Michael Kessler, I want to thank you all for joining us today. We have a real treat in store for those of us who have been following and engaging with the many forms of discussion and activity at the intersection of religion and diplomacy in recent years. It won't be news to anyone in this room, it won't be news to the core constituency of the Berkley Center that there's just been a lot of action in this space over the last 10 years or so, from efforts on the part of the Obama administration to kind of to scale up U.S. governmental engagement with religion across various sectors and agencies of the federal government. Obviously, in the diplomatic space, this has been most clearly embodied by the establishment in 2013 of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the State Department, headed by our director here, Sean Casey. I also had the opportunity to spend some time working in that office during that period. Obviously, under the current administration, we've seen a renewed emphasis and focus on issues related to religious freedom. And I think it's interesting that we're having this event today just in the immediate aftermath of the first meeting of the State Department's new Commission on Unalienable Rights, which has been a source of some discussion, debate, and controversy because many perceive the kind of framework of unalienable rights to be a space in which kind of religiously inflected conceptions of rights may gain stronger currency within broader human rights discourse. Here to help us make sense of all of this, I'm happy to say, we have Dr. Gregorio Bettiza, who teaches at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and his presence with us today is occasioned by the publication of this fantastic new book, Finding Faith in Foreign Policy. Something that is just a very attractive resource and tool for the many of us who have been involved in this kind of work in the trenches, and sometimes perhaps so in the trenches that we are not able to understand the broader context in which these developments have played out. And that's precisely what this book does. So I would heartily recommend it to you. Happily, the publisher in its generosity is offering 30% off copies if you'd like to purchase them. I have flyers. I'll leave them right here. I've got to say, it makes a fantastic Halloween, Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Eid, Christmas gift. I can't think of a better thing to do that. So I'm also very pleased that we are joined here at the front table by a very close colleague and friend at the Berkley Center, Katherine Marshall, who's a senior fellow here at the Berkley Center, also a professor of practice in the School of Foreign Service and the executive director of the World Faiths Development Institute, which operates out of the Berkley Center here, and someone who it is very accurate, no hyperbole at all, very accurate to say is a genuine pioneer with respect to the intersection of particularly development work and religion, but someone who is doing this back in the 90s, long before we had dedicated research centers and books and offices and governmental institutions devoted to this work. A real trailblazer, and it's a treat to have her with us to provide some remarks in the immediate aftermath of Dr. Bettiza's presentation. So, without further ado, let me ask you to join me in welcoming Gregorio Bettiza.
So, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, very much, Berkeley Center. Thank you, Katherine, for agreeing to discuss today my talk. And it's wonderful to be back in DC, a city I love. And as I tweeted, I just joined Twitter as well, and as I tweeted yesterday, the city of love, because here I met my wife, Katie, that is here. And oddly enough, for a Roman like me, many people come to Rome to get married. It so happened that I got married in Washington, D.C. And without her and her support and advice throughout these years, the book would not exist. But also, talking about D.C., the United States has really been a long-standing part of my family's history. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my mother are all journalists, and they've all wrote about and from the United States. So the US has always been part of the history of my family back in Italy. And also my undergraduate dissertation, my master's dissertation, and my PhD have all been on US and US politics. What is instead particularly new for me was that while I was living here in the mid-2000s, second half of the 2000s, working for the World Bank, as a good European, I really thought that modernity meant secularization. Secularization and the decline of religion for me were sort of taken for granted. And yet I was here while in the White House there was a born-again president. And for me, again, as a European, America embodied the quintessential aspects of modernity. And nonetheless, the president was highly religious. 9/11 had just occurred and had brought Islam center stage in world politics. And Huntington's clash of civilization theories seemed prophetic. And at that moment that I realized that was something wrong with the way I was seeing the world. The world was not inevitably becoming more secular. Religion mattered. And I brought these two things together, an old interest in the US with a renewed change of perspective of the role of religion in contemporary world politics, and put them together as a sort of PhD application, and that began the journey that led to the publication of this book. Now, when I start this story in Europe, as I've done already in a few times, book presentations, I really have to contextualize a lot what's going on and spend a lot of time, while in this place maybe a bit less, on what has been happening in the US. But one place that I like to start, and I've started in the past presentation, has been with something quite unique. I mean, there's a lot quite unique about the Trump presidency, of course, but something quite unique that President Trump did when he embarked on his first foreign trip abroad. His first foreign trip abroad, rather than running into Mexico or Canada, as was generally the habit, was very much framed in highly religious symbolic terms. And here's the National Security Advisor, General McMaster, as Trump was embarking on a trip that took him first to Saudi Arabia, then Israel, then Rome and the Vatican City and other stops following that. And this was the statement: this trip is truly historic. No president has ever visited the homelands and holy sites of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths all in one. So the trip was not just necessarily a trip to countries or states or people. It was a trip to religions. And here are some images of the three stops, where in all of these, along with this highly religious symbolism, a sort of a pilgrimage to the homelands, symbolic homelands of the three main religions, Trump also engaged in a variety of practices and actions that had a religious element to them. Here, the inauguration, further down, of a sort of a countering violent extremism center, and in the middle, of course, praying at the Western Wall, and the very important alliance between the US and Israel in general, and certain elements of the between Trump and Netanyahu as well, and the move of the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in the aftermath, and here a visit also to the Pope in Rome. Now, how can we make sense of this event? And well, there's a long history of course, the US and American entanglements with religion, and this has been told in very fascinating ways as well by, for example, William M. Bowden during the Cold War and Andrew Preston. But something has happened since the end of the Cold War that has sort of given also very much meaning to an action like this. And what has happened since the end of the Cold War, and I don't have to tell the audience here, which I'm sure is very familiar, is that religion across a variety of areas has become an explicit and institutionalized object and subject of US foreign policy in ways that I would argue in the book, have been quite unprecedented in US history. Of course, in 1998, with the IRFA Act, the International Religious Freedom Office was created in the State Department and an independent commission along with it. Religious freedom now was going to be monitored through a variety of reports and programs to promote religious freedom and so on. Then in 2001, as George W. Bush was campaigning on his compassionate conservative agenda, as soon as he came into the White House, he signed a series of executive orders really scaling up the charitable choice and turning it into a full-blown faith-based initiatives with offices in the White House and a new office in the USAID that came about a few years later. And here's the image from the website, the newer one under Trump, basically. All of these are latest sort of images or screenshots of the websites today. What is quite important, though, and I'll mention this, of course, much of these executive orders occurred before 9/11, and after 9/11, we saw an increasing focus on the Muslim world and on Islam in US foreign policy under the Bush administration first, and then here's Obama's very famous Cairo speech to the Muslim world, the first time that a US president really very much sort of addressed, again, a bit like Trump did in that trip, not just a nation, not just a sort of a region, but an entire community defined chiefly by their religious identity, the Muslim world. And along with it, a variety of appointees have emerged in the State Department and policies countering violent extremism and so on, really focusing on reforming Muslim societies, politics, and potentially also religion, of course. And fourth, actually, I mean, and Peter just alluded to it, in 2013, what has generally been referred to as either faith-based diplomacy or religious engagement found its home in the State Department with a new office headed by Sean Casey, which now, of course, heads the center. Now, again, in Europe, I would go in much more detail into all of these, and I don't think I have to do that here. But the point being is, what has happened? So I sort of argue, broadly speaking, here's a table from the book, that really since the end of the Cold War, from the 1990s, across a variety of areas, religion has quite unexpectedly become an organized and institutionalized subject, as I mentioned earlier, of US foreign policy, with the objective to manage and marshal, I would argue, the power of faith to advance American interests and values globally. And there's a table that shows how this has occurred. Now, driving this book and the argument are three main questions. First, why has there been a growing focus across multiple different administrations, Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, and now Trump, on religion in US foreign policy? How have the boundaries between church and state, or religion and state, and faith and foreign policy been redefined in the process? And third, what are the global effects of the growing entanglements between the sacred and the foreign policy of arguably the most powerful state in the international system? Now, I will first touch upon and try to give an answer to question number one, and then I'll move to question number two, and finally to question number three. Now, the causes. The causes are complex and multiple, and we academics love to say complex and multiple, of course, all the time, but I'm going to try to make sense of these. But one thing I sort of want to highlight is that we can provide a multiplicity of explanation. One generally some mostly think about is, of course, the role of politicized evangelicals and the Christian or religious right more broadly. But their influence, yes, is very important, but it only partially explains the international religious freedom regime, and to some extent may explain what I call regimes, to some extent may explain the turn towards faith-based initiatives, but definitely does not fully account for the Islamic and Muslim interventions, and nor for the religious engagement office. Now we may want to turn to personalities, and again, George W. Bush, and as I mentioned earlier, often features large in this story. And a variety of accounts have emerged over these years, really focusing on individually on these policies. But what I try to do in this book is to take them together. Take them both separately and compare them, but also together as a wider turn towards making religion an object of US foreign policy. And again, the Bush or the explanation of various presidents are quite important, but let's just take Bush. Well, the IRFA Act passed before him. Religious engagement and the office in the State Department had a special case. He came after, so just individual president, especially Bush, is not enough. Thirdly, we want to look not just as domestic advocacy groups, nor as presidents, but at the international system itself. And here, of course, the role of political Islam and the events of 9/11 is crucial to the story, but again, it's not enough, because at least two of the policies emerged before international religious freedom and faith-based initiatives. And definitely very important 9/11, of course, to the policies that focused on the Muslim world, and to some extent also the Religious and Global Affairs Office in the State Department. So the point being here is that I would argue that we have to situate these various forces in a wider context, in a wider global context that, drawing on various literatures, of course, José Casanova here and Habermas and many others, I would argue we could conceptualize and define in terms of an emerging post-secular world society. And what is this post-secular world society? Well, it's constituted by two main forces. One, which many of you, of course, are very familiar with, is processes related to the global resurgence of religion, where religious actors, identities, have become increasingly salient politically over the past decades. Some trace it, and really the sort of the benchmark date is 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. Others point to the fall of the communist regime in 1989, and so on. But the point being is that religion, rather than becoming sort of disappearing, has staged a dramatic comeback in the past decades. And I really particularly like this photo of Hindu nationalist Narendra Modi, because the idea that modernity really is sort of has the acids and that destroy religion. Well, it's fascinating how actually new technology actually enable religious messages, whether for good or bad, especially in the case of ISIS, bad, to spread much more easily and powerfully around the world. And also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has acquired what was a more nationalist sort of conflict dimension, has increasingly acquired a much more religious dimension also over the years. But that's not enough. That's not the full story. There has also been a wider change in thinking. The emergence across a variety of milieus, intellectual milieus of what Jürgen Habermas, and I take from him, calls post-secular consciousness. Literature rethinking the secular paradigms, and where the secularization theory is really is actually still stands today. Again, José Casanova, very important here with his book, Public Religions. But I wanted to highlight Peter Berger's book, of course, The De-secularization of the World in 1999, which is very important. A sociologist of religion that has spent much of his career really formulating the secularization theory, recanting the theory, but also what is fascinating, I don't know how many of you may know this, is that this this book. It's an edited volume. Amongst them, there's also Grace Davy, a very important sociologist of religion European. She's emeritus at Exeter University, for example. But the events and the conferences that led to these papers were brought together by the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the EPPC, a Washington-based think tank. And here the story begins a little bit. So there are wider changes in terms of resurgence of religion. There's changes in terms of how scholars start to think about the modern world, not necessarily anymore secular. And what all of this does is brings forward what I have called in the book a variety of de-secularizing actors. That is, the actors in the context of the US that have pushed American foreign policy, have argued that American foreign policy is problematically secular in the context of a religiously fervent world, and that it has to grapple with the fact that religion matters in different ways. And it has to grapple for a variety of reasons. I would argue most either principled reasons, or especially in the beginning of the religious freedom phase, that was a very principled type of argument, or for strategic reasons. Well, without understanding the role of religion, we cannot pursue or defend ourselves from terrorism and so on. And I argue there are three types of important actors. Activists, which are not just confined to Protestant evangelicals, but here's a great table by the Pew, a report by Alan Hertzky that came out a few years ago that shows the rise of religious advocacy groups in Washington, D.C. over the years, pushing for some of these policies. Experts, and here we are, the Berkley Center for Religion and World Affairs, created after 9/11, basically, and many other initiatives that really emerged at Brookings, at CSIS, and many other places in Washington, D.C., very much arguing, and across also the wider spectrum, also in Harvard and so on, arguing that U.S. foreign policy needed to understand religion better. Very famous, the Chicago Council report, for example, that came out just before Obama was elected. And third, a set of policy makers. Here's the story of the presidents, but it's not just confined to presidents. Secretary of State John Kerry very famously said that if he would go back, he would study comparative religions, not political science, given the important role that religion plays in the modern world. And members of Congress are very important in the story, in fact, of international religious freedom. So these wider changes are encapsulated by the emergence of a set of actors domestically in the US that have argued that American foreign policy is too secular in the context of a religiously fervent world, and it needs to change its policy. And they've contested the secularity of US foreign policy. And in contesting the secularity of US foreign policy, they've opened up space for these various policies to emerge. The event of 9/11 could have been interpreted in many different ways, and Colin Powell, for example, dramatically sought to interpret it not in religious terms, but much more in terms of this terrorist group that we have in a very realist fashion. The event of 9/11 had to be interpreted as in a way or another, as a religious event, or something that maybe had nothing to do with religion itself, because religion, Islam in this case, is something very different, but nonetheless religion would come back into the story somehow. And so what has happened, I argue, and this is in the answer of the second question, to what extent and how have the boundaries between religion and the state been shifting, as these actors would come forward to contest the secularity of US foreign policy and open up space to promote and monitor religious freedom, or to seek to reform Islam and promote moderate Islam, and so on. There has been a process of foreign policy desecularization. And I trace in the book, in particular, four processes. Now, I don't want to bore you too much and get too much into the detail and maybe arcane, maybe jargony academic language, but what I do in the book is show that there have been four types of processes of desecularization. One, institutional, that is the opening up of space within these institutions, in the State Department, in the White House, and so on, for the creation of these new offices that would bring either religious knowledge or religious individuals and figures, and much more close to the sort of policy-making structures of U.S. foreign policy. And the other three processes of desecularization, epistemic, ideological, and normative, are more in terms of a change of mentality. Epistemic desecularization has been promoted to the extent that while before religion did not appear to matter, actually now religion increasingly started to be seen as a very important factor in world politics that US foreign policymakers needed to grapple with, either in terms of religious freedom or faith-based actors doing fantastic work in Africa that we should support and tap into, for example, rather than ignoring them. An ideological de-secularization very much refers to the idea that a sort of ideologically secular position sees religion as a problem, principally as a problem. And so the job here was to argue, well, religion is not just a problem, but it's also a solution, a story that we've heard many times, also here. And third, normative. That is, rethinking the norms of church and state separation, especially away from a very strict interpretation of the establishment clause towards a more accommodationist interpretation. And so for these actors to open up space in the context of US foreign policy, to engage religion, to monitor religious freedom, to seek to raise the voices of moderate Muslims, or to fund faith-based organizations around the world, I argue that these processes of desecularization have been taking place and have allowed this to happen. Now, third, what are the global consequences of these policies? Now, here's a very important caveat I would like to make about the book and the argument I'm about to embark here, which is my interest with this book has very much been to understand change over time. How global religious changes have led to changes in institutions and practices of US foreign policy, and at the same time how changes in US foreign policy institutions and practices may be leading to changes in global religious and secular realities. Out there's a wealth of literature, either quite critical and sometimes also polemic against this turn towards religion in US foreign policy, and another set of literature quite actually supportive and quite advocating, for example, and again, much of what has been coming out from the center has tended to be on this side of the debate of the idea that the US should, in different shapes and forms, engage with religion much more. So I argue that there have been three in particular effects of these policies. Now, in the book, it's more, so this is more speculative to the extent that I often, in fact, emphasize the potential of change, because the research really focuses, and let's call it that ethnographic work and the interviews have been done in Washington, D.C., not around the world to see the changes. But I would argue that we see three potential changes. The first one is that these policies will attempt to shape global religious realities along American norms and interests, and in particular in three ways. One, I try to unpack in much more detailed way, I would argue that has been done so far as well, how the so-called secular blind spot many desecularizing actors have argued as problematic in the context of the US foreign policy has been replaced by the Christian soft spot, and in particular in two policy areas, in the international religious freedom space and in the faith-based initiatives one as well. And I can get into that a little bit more maybe in the conversation. But at the same time also, the engagement with religion and also religious freedom policies have also advanced, I would argue, a radically pluralist understanding of religion. Now, because if one reads the reports, the State Department reports of international religious freedom, of course, a variety of groups and not just Christian ones, although the understanding of religion that permeates in these reports is, I would argue, building on literature on this, is a sort of a Christian imprint on that. But nonetheless, they go in the rescue of all sorts of religious groups. Of course, Muslim in Uzbekistan and Alevis, Baha'is, and so on. But I wanted to highlight as a European, I found very interesting, also arguing Scientology as a religion. While in Europe, instead, the attitude towards Scientology, for example, has been much more that this is more of a cult, or in Germany as a business group, actually, they've argued. And in the reports, they really highlight this tension. And so this is closer, and that's why The Guardian is their sort of British magazine, so to highlight the sort of European perspective. The point being, and of course, then there's the Baha'is with Iran, and the Alevis and Jehovah's Witnesses with Russia, and so on, a variety. And now the point is not to get into the idea, what is a religion, what is a cult, what is a sect, what is a business, or what is not, what is that. But nonetheless, the way the US operates in its understanding of religion tends to be radically quite pluralist, in ways that a majority of states around the world and societies do not recognize certain groups as being religious or traditional religions. And third, it has tended to support what US foreign policy makers identify as true, good, or useful religion. In the case, most importantly here, of course, is the idea of finding moderate Muslims, supporting moderate Muslims, and so on. But also, for example, the activities in the State Department, the religion of global affairs. So I speculate in the book that probably the actors that the office under Sean Casey would engage with in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be very different and would have a view of how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict very different from the actors at Trump office, although now the office has been sort of downsized and so on, would have engaged with in the context of US foreign policy in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And there was a conversation, I think, here, which I watched online, about some of the concerns. Okay, there's this office, but when Obama leaves, who's going to take this office over, and how are policies going to change accordingly? So what are the religious actors that US foreign policy makers will engage with will very much depend and argue on four factors in the book: national security interests, the ideological and political inclination of the party and president in power at the time, the history of history and identity and norms around religion in the context of the US, and also the interests of the various religious actors that take hold of these policies. Now, very quickly, going towards the end, a second effect, I argue, we see is what I label the religionization of world politics. Now, these policies very much sort of enable religion to become more relevant in the context of US foreign policy making and also around the world. And I argue through two mechanisms. One, through what I suggest is the mechanism of elevation. So in the case of PEPFAR, a substantial amount of funds are provided to faith-based charities and organizations to provide healthcare and so on, services across Africa, in ways that if these organizations had not received these amounts of funds, they would not be as present and as relevant on the ground in various parts of Africa to do the things they are doing. And so likewise, opening up the White House or the State Department to various religious voices sort of elevates, and the language of elevation is very clear with elevating the voices of the moderate Muslims. So it's bringing these religious actors much more upfront in various public and policy settings around the world. And second, through processes of categorization. I think also Peter Mandeville has discussed some of these issues, especially around the idea of the Muslim world, right? So many of these policies, in particular around religious freedom especially, but also the Muslim and Islamic initiatives, tend to assign a priori a religious identity or a religious cause to a particular situation, which becomes defined more in religious terms than in other terms that it could have been defined. Going back to the example of 9/11, should we or should we not define it as a religious event, for example? And here's an image of the special representative to Muslim communities under Obama. Now, third point I highlight in the book is that what America does has been very important to the rest of the world. It has promoted, directly or indirectly, through two principal mechanisms, the diffusion of the operationalization of religion in international policy. The US was probably the first state, to my understanding, to really institutionalize the promotion of religious freedom. And following that, a variety of other states, Canada, Italy, the UK here, where I'm based now at the moment, follow suit. And also in the religious engagement space, for example, various states, also in Italy, France is very important in this issue, have really looked at the American experience, and those that have participated in the American experience have traveled to Europe as well to share knowledge and experiences and so on. And second, through processes of circulation, I would argue. So diffusion is a much more linear mechanism where the US starts something and others sort of, these policies diffuse either because of active engagement on the part of American foreign policy makers or Europeans in particular emulating what the US has been doing. And second, circulation, especially in the space of counterterrorism and also in faith-based initiative, the US has not been at the forefront necessarily. Britain has been very much also at the forefront of some of these policies, and I chose again this image to show that there's a wider circulation of knowledge and experiences where the US is not clearly necessarily at the forefront or at the beginning of these policies, but nonetheless takes a very important role either in funding or coordinating various transnational activities that for example, here is the opening of the Countering Violent Extremism Center in Saudi Arabia, for example. So why the reflections, and before I conclude? So one of the key reflections that comes out from this book, I would argue, and again, really, although it's not a comparative study, maybe it's an exaggeration to say I've put on my Tocquevillian lenses as a European coming to the US and really trying to really understand what is happening here, but nonetheless having Europe always in the background of my mind, as the realization that the way the US engages religion is a very American way of doing things. When I look at Italy, when I look at the UK, they do so in their own context-specific and country-specific ways. Second, one of the things that has been studied much less in the various scholarship that has emerged over the past years and decades looking at these policies is not only how states are retooling themselves in the context of a world of resurgence religions, but also how religious actors themselves are retooling themselves to this new era of engagement by states with them, for example, and how religions are also changing and being changed and shaping themselves. So I would argue that there's much more work to be done on the field to see where sort of the rubber hits the road in terms of some of these policies. And third, and here again, Peter Mandeville actually is trailblazing in this area. And when I finished the book, I think a few years ago, I was saying, well, maybe are we in a new era of religious geopolitics, where states in different ways seek to manage, promote, or marshal, or draw upon religious actors in the pursuit of their national interests and also values, of course, abroad. And this is a phenomenon that has not been happening just in the US and also has a much longer history, and it has been happening in a variety of other places. And if that is the case, is the international system within which we live still a Westphalian system? Here we're really like traveling at high conceptual spaces. What do I mean by this? Well, the international state system is built on the norm of sovereignty, where you don't intervene in domestic affairs of other states. And this norm of sovereignty was very much built out of the wars of religion, the European experience, where you don't intervene in domestic affairs of foreign countries, especially in the religious domestic affair of foreign countries, right? The Protestant Reformation and so on. So in a world where maybe states are intervening directly or indirectly much more in the domestic religious affairs of other countries, is this international system still a Westphalian one? Thank you very much, and here's the cover of the book.
Thank you very much, Gregorio, for a very engaging and rich presentation. I'm going to invite Katherine Marshall to the podium now to offer some reactions and reflections before we open up to a wider discussion with all of you. Katherine?
You want me at the podium? No. Okay. Well, good afternoon. I warned Peter that I could talk for at least an hour, but I promise I'm not going to. There's so many reactions, though, to this very fascinating sort of overview of what's happening in the world, which is, I think, what we're all spending our time thinking about. I thought I would comment just on three threads in this. The first one is this question of blindness. The second is some of the sort of practical issues that we see. And then the third are maybe some of the deeper issues that emerge from thinking about the religious engagement. On the blind spot, I think we have to recognize that the statistic that keeps getting kicked around, we're not quite sure what it really means, is that 84% of the world's population has some religious affiliation. Now, the message here is it's big, and not only big, it's very big. It's a substantial force, and yet it was essentially absent in most of the sort of diplomatic discourse and approaches, et cetera. So a lot of the sort of de-secularization, or whatever you call it, has been really a counterbalance to what, and something that we call basically religious literacy. I mean, a real common sense trying to eliminate blindness. Now, we exaggerate. Anyone who worked with the subcontinent and the partition of India, Pakistan, could not have ignored the fact that the religion was important. Vatican politics has been important, Vatican II, et cetera. But I think that there was a colossal blindness, that this issue of religious literacy, a professionalization, let's take this seriously, has been and remains a very central driving force, and one that's important. But it also raised for me, I guess, my sort of central question in reading the book and in listening to you, which is how much has really changed? Now, let me give you one example. Many of you know that I came to this topic almost accidentally 20 years ago when I was drafted by the president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfensohn, to work on a dialogue process with the world of religion. And I think there is one aspect of that we shouldn't forget, which is that when he announced a dialogue, not money, but a dialogue, his view is that 184 countries out of 184 opposed it, including the United States. In other words, major hesitations. But let me add, from last Saturday, there was an event at the Center for Global Development celebrating Jim Wolfensohn's sort of achievements in life, including a video, and Larry Summers, the infamous Larry Summers, Harvard president, World Bank chief economist, as well as Secretary of the Treasury, was giving one of the tributes. And one of Larry's comments was that Jim Wolfensohn had expanded the agenda in remarkable ways, dealing with disability, dealing with corruption, dealing with you-know-what, et cetera. And he said, including he said something about, expanding to faith-based initiatives, which I'm not sure was a good idea, he said. And I would also comment that if you actually look at 20 years and within the World Bank, but I would say Inter-American Bank, Asian Bank, African Bank, most UN agencies, and you actually look at how much real attention and focus there is on professional analysis of religious issues, it's pretty paltry. In other words, the sort of real impact is still pretty limited. So I think that the question of how much has really shifted is this surface. Now, we know it's on the front page of the State Department now. Trump's speech at the United Nations General Assembly was focused on religion, but how much even press comment did that get? So I think this question, for many of us, look, let's take this seriously. This is a very important issue for a lot of people. It's very complicated. It permeates virtually any issue you deal with, whether it's environment or peace and conflict or reconciliation, family planning, women's rights, you name it. These are critically important issues that need to be looked at carefully. I'm not convinced that we're very near. So that's sort of my first comment. Second, getting a little bit deeper, I mean, clearly there is this tension now between religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief, never quite sure what the belief part of it really involves, and religious engagement, and the tension about it, and also, I think, even more significantly with human rights. Now, clearly, freedom of belief is a fundamental part of the whole history of thinking about human rights. And yet, there has been this sort of stark separation between the advocacy communities for human rights and for religious freedom. And I think that's something that needs a lot more reflection. In fact, when we look back, we couldn't even find it on our website exactly. But when Ken Roth gave a speech some years ago at Georgetown about sort of religion and human rights, one of his comments might have even been an off the cuff, was that he hadn't really had to think about that very much. That it was really not very much part of the way that they thought about it. But it does, the religious engagement really means who are you engaging with? In other words, it takes you to the institutional side, and it is this question of who's at the table. And is it the sort of traditional religious leaders, or is it, in our favored term, religious actors, which can be a much broader group of people. So this question of how do you engage in this huge, complicated, messy, changing world in useful, professional, constructive ways. So I think that sort of takes us into the second question and to me it does take you to the imperative of trying to have a strategic approach, but at the same time being willing to deal with micro issues. So you get to water supply or the issues around the refugee and the roles of religious institutions in refugee institutions. So third, I just want to touch on a couple of what I see as important issues. One of the things, again, that I was reacting to listening to you, I think that as we think about some of the American dimensions, but also European, it's sort of as if, where's the deep state? I'm not sure how much you've dealt with the family and the National Prayer Breakfast and what is going on under the surface. One of the features of the Obama approach is it's not been formalized. There have not been the visible appointments of people. So a lot of this is taking place off stage. And I think that's one of the issues. And finally, I have to finish by saying one issue that is, to me, very fundamental to these debates about religious freedom, religious engagement, human rights, is this fundamental issue of men and women, not to speak of LGBT. And clearly one of the things, there are a lot of my colleagues from the World Bank, I don't know how yours react, who think I've lost my mind to be devoting my life and career to these kinds of questions. But one of the things is every time they see a picture of an all-male group, they say, well, these people are not serious. This is just not even worth thinking about. But even more is what we're now calling, what we've called for a long time, actually, going back to Cairo and Beijing, an unholy alliance, but an unholy alliance that has, I think, been expanded in recent years, and which, to me, is doing extraordinary things where various countries inspired or linked to their religious identities and politics are opposing UN resolutions on violence against women, domestic violence, rape in the case of war, not to speak of family planning. So I think that the sort of new extremist politics with its links to extremism, but also to populism and also to various forms of religious and political nationalism are things that mean that these are issues that we need to pay attention to and that we need more understanding, more dialogue, more reflection.
Thank you very much, Katherine. Before we open the discussion up to the audience, I wanted to give Gregorio an opportunity to respond briefly to some of the points that Katherine raised, and also add one of my own, if I may, which is, I guess, to maybe push a little more deeply into the space that Katherine opened by inquiring about how much has actually changed. But maybe getting a little bit more specifically to the methodology within the book itself, where you have an impressive array of interviews with various people. But looking over the list of interviews, one can't help but notice that you're mainly talking to people who are either embedded within or otherwise invested in the sort of machinery surrounding the various regimes that you're talking about. So these are either US government figures working in institutions focused on religion or offices focused on religion, or leaders within non-governmental or faith-based organizations. But there's not a lot of just American diplomats that you've spoken to. And so I guess I wonder if you had also spoken to a lot of our run-of-the-mill everyday diplomats about this sort of de-secularization process that you're positing, how much of them would recognize that as actually going on? I just remember working in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, even 3 years after we were set up, we would routinely visit some other office within the State Department and say, hi, we're from the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. And they'd say, oh, yeah, the Religious Freedom Office. No. Religion and Global Affairs, we do religious engagement. And they'd say, what's religious engagement? So even within the State Department itself, much less, across the machinery of US national security and foreign policy, I'm not entirely sure that the message had gotten out that we're in a de-secularization phase right now.
And we still have that issue, I'll just say, to back that up, coming from the remnants of RGA.
Thank you very much. James Alexander from the State Department and what remains of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs.
Okay, so how do I turn this off? I'm back. Okay, I thought in the bottom, but this doesn't. No. Okay, so thank you very much. It was very, very, I think, poignant remarks, and also what you just said, Peter. So. There's a lot to chew, and I want to leave time to the conversation and discussions and questions. So what I will do is maybe address this: how much change, how much desecularization now, and briefly maybe touch upon the issue of detention for a second. So what I try to do in the book is walk a very fine line, and this has brought me a lot of trouble over the years, between a variety of perspectives. So just to give you a sense, I presented this book last week at LSE, where I did my PhD, and on my left I had Mick Cox. I don't know if any of you know him, but he's sort of the major figure on US foreign policy in the context of the UK. And he goes, well, but the world was never secular to begin with, and it's always been very religious, and what's new here? On the other hand, I had Katherine Della Cura, a scholar of Islam and the Middle East, which was the supervisor of my dissertation, and she said completely the opposite. No, actually, the secularization has occurred. Secularization is still occurring. And it's, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Olivier Roy story. It's a bit that. But what we're seeing, the resurgence of religion is just some last remnants of sort of the flicker before the fire of religion disappears. Right? And this is the same here. So I think in the debates about how much has changed, I think on the one hand, we have stories that come out mostly from the Immanent Frame, for example. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that blog, that actually argue, well, a lot has changed. It's taking over, and it's the new civilizing mission, and the picture that comes out there is a picture of radical change and these policies and sort of religion really becoming, and some of the more polemic also books about separation of church and state. Oh, it's falling apart and dropping off, and so on and so forth. It's a new with some books during the Bush years, a new theocracy, and so on, right? So that's one side of the story. And I react against that side in the book, and I'll explain how. But the other side is exactly what rightly so, you point out here, which is, well, not much has changed. We need more, but that more is not forthcoming, and in reality, it's small things and so on. And in the book, I really play a little bit around with these two stories, and what I try to argue is, especially, yeah, I mean, we do see some change. We do see some new offices. We do see some people that were not invited at the table being invited at the table. And we do see a sense that religion, in a way or another, we need to grapple with it. Even by President Obama going to Cairo, or Kerry saying that he would study religion. So it does now, to the extent that, again, as someone would argue, the entire US foreign policy machinery has changed. No, certainly not. And in fact, what I would argue is certain pockets have been opened, but probably not the entire system has changed. Neither for the worst, as some of the more polemic literature says, and neither for the better, as maybe some would argue that that's what we would need. And I also use a particular concept of the de-secular, which I'm not going to go too much into here, that sort of tries to navigate a bit of some of these tensions. So the other point that I highlight in the book is that, again, against this idea of, look, this is a radical, incredible change, is that the US foreign policy is a complex system where there are a lot of interests to be navigated. So the same way that religious freedom is not a priority oftentimes, likewise is human rights not a priority. There are other issues. Saudi Arabia, you've got to be a partner, and China, how are you going to deal with China? So there's also these policies are in tension with a variety of other priorities in the context of US foreign policy. So it's not just only the fact that they are religious and have their religious dimension, but they also are one thing. So for example, the group that ended up establishing the Religious Engagement Office during the Clinton administration, Clinton Secretary of State, era, if I'm not mistaken, there were a variety of groups of engagement with civil society, right? With women's and labor and other groups, if I'm not mistaken, and there was the religion one, right? So religion is also is one aspect of a variety of things when you engage with civil society. And so then even here, then you have to compete. So it's women groups or religious groups. And then again, going back to the issue you mentioned about gender and so on. So, so definitely, I mean, I try not to be too naive in the book as much as possible, but I may be, I don't know, and I'm very open to the criticism or critiques around this, but to navigate some of these issues. Finally, and then I'll leave it like that, absolutely yes. I think one of the big challenges in writing this book has been both to say the whole picture, but nonetheless to leave space to the individual policies, to the complex tensions between religious freedom and religious engagement. And even these policies have different constituencies, and so I use a variety of terminology: actors, coalitions, constituencies, and networks and constellations to really open up the space. For example, in the religious freedom space, there's not one voice, there are many voices. There are many religious groups, there are many different understandings of religious freedom, a more sort of the more conservative maybe side and the more progressive side. There's also a tension between an understanding of religious freedom as an end and religious freedom as a means. And so what I try also to do in this book is to show how these various tensions and interpretation, even of just on policies, let alone across policies, lead to different shapes and forms across time and administrations of these policies and institutions themselves. So that's, I always try, there's always this constant tension I try to do in the book between the general and the particular, a lot of change, no change, and so on. And so I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. So we have
the better part of half an hour still for your thoughts and reactions and questions. And I think we have a microphone, if I'm not mistaken, that's available. So if we're asking a question, if you could just very briefly identify yourself for our speakers' benefit. So who would like to open up? Please, ma'am.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Cynthia Butler. I'm a lawyer, Georgetown grad, and work in interfaith dialogue. And I'm curious about the post-secular architecture, and would like you to maybe speak about what possible sort of guardrails that guard against human rights abuses in that context should be or could be or are constructed. Because I'm thinking, for instance, of Turkey, where secularization was an advancement in civilization because it was veering away from a very abusive religious structure. And as we go from secularization in Turkey to a more overtly Islamicized environment with a dictator emerging, what sorts of guardrails in this post-secular age are we aspiring to create?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Well, at the risk of boring you all to death, I could speak on the post-secular for as well a good part of an hour. So, okay, let's put it like that. The way I see it, and actually last week there was a very interesting speaker here, Christina Stöckel, for example, that I don't know how many of you came to the talk about the globalization of the culture wars and the role of the Russian Orthodox Church and Russian foreign policy and so on. She was a colleague of mine when I did the postdoc at the European University Institute, so I really am fond of her research and so on. And we have very different opinions, me and her, on the post-secular. Now, this is all, I'll get to the question, which is, now, in a European, and let's put it like that, Habermasian context, within which my intellectual sort of, where I move myself intellectually and the book is placed, the post-secular is a liberal attitude, liberal in the classical sense of liberalism, not in necessarily the American sense of on the left, attitude on the post-secular, which is, well, we liberals thought that we were quite pluralist and open to different voices in civil society, but actually, especially when it comes to religion, we are not. So we actually like religion in the private sphere, but not really that public. And so for Habermas, a sort of a heir of the Enlightenment tradition, to come forward and say, well, us liberals need to rethink our position towards religion, whereas we should be much more open to religious arguments and religious ethics and reasoning in the public sphere than we have been so far. And so this is how he understands the post-secular. So the post-secular is for him, and also for me, is as being more true to a sort of classical liberal sense of civil society in a public sphere. Habermas still maintains a very strong division between church and state, whereas find more religious voices in the public sphere, and he, for a variety of reasons. One, because in Europe there is a very important Muslim immigration, and so how are we going to sort of engage with a variety of actors that are very publicly religious in ways that Christianity has over time not been anymore, but also, as he argues, as religions providing a very important ethical reasoning against the ravages of modern capitalism and so on. Now that the left is sort of in disarray after the end of the Cold War, what are some ethical insights that we can bring to the table to temper this sort of capitalism out of control or modernity out of control? So it's a very liberal understanding of the post-secular, and this is where, to some extent, the book moves. Now, there's another that I would argue, and I've been playing around with another colleague, and with Christina Stöckel as well, and some others, which is actually the post-secular is post-liberal. Which is this idea that also in Russia, again, and possibly also in Turkey, where actually the post-secular means an opening of the public space to religion, but not to religions that are willing to accept a pluralist public sphere and a sort of democratic process and so on, but much more, some would argue, fundamentalist or authoritarian or traditionalist or conservative or whatever term we want to put in there. So many in Russia have jumped on the post-secular, especially because it has allowed greater space for the Russian Orthodox Church to do things in Russia and around the world. So to answer, I'm not really answering your question to the extent that I think there is an important tension between how certain scholars in my case and political actors understand what this post-secular means and what it enables. And definitely there is a space for more authoritarian, possibly forms of religion or more fundamentalist ones to gain greater space in the public sphere, although that's not the Habermasian interpretation which I subscribe for.
Herbert Regenbogen. I'm a fellow at the Catholic University of America. I'm professor for international relations and international law. And I'd like to pivot to the issue of international relations in the context of faith, that being religious or secular, and freedom in terms of the conscience, which is a spillover, when it ever does occur, from beliefs and principles to turn into policy, foreign policy. Example, slavery, the consciousness of the American experience. But America, for 150 years, experienced also what is called neutrality, which is about impartiality, which is a total forgotten token since World War II. And yet, the Pope Francis speaks of positive neutrality, and that is the impartiality to engage. And as we know, there's a growing schism within the Catholic Church about positive neutrality. But that brings to this manifold of the three dimensions, the pillars of governance: faith, freedom, and foreign policy or public policy. In that context, security is the utmost important part of moving from state-centricism, Westphalian model, to the human security because of the threats of the 21st century: societal, environmental, religious. And these are the issues which I believe are still underdeveloped. What are the pivotal points of security within the foreign policy to interpretation? Is the security the one which does not allow us to evolve into greater tolerance for ourselves and for others? Or does it pivot us to the idea of a defensiveness to which exactly authoritarian governments find space and justification? So my question is, what is the role of security within your research for those policies?
Okay, just to clarify, security, whose security? Of humanity or of the US?
Human security is a IR which talks about groups. That means state-centricism was about state-to-state relationships,
Yes.
where the vacuum was about human rights, the individual rights, group rights, the family rights, which are culturally different. And yet, this is where religion finds its greatest foundation base. So it's about this kind of understanding of human security and approaching the challenges of the 21st century: food, water, etc.
Okay, so I'm not 100% sure if I'm answering your question, but I'll attempt. And what I will say, and I'll be quite frank about this in ways maybe that I have not been so, not here, but also in other places so far. I think that religion absolutely is fundamental to many of these challenges. The fact that the Pope, or there's also been an Islamic declaration on climate change, that there is momentum around these issues, around issues with refugees, around the very important work done, of course, by faith-based organizations in a variety of places in Africa. Absolutely, I think religions are fundamental to human security in terms of food, health, and even in the wider context of the environment. Now, what I also, though, to some extent wonder is to what extent states should mobilize religions, that's why I was asking states or not, for their own security purposes. Now, maybe it's inevitable that that happens. Because by being a very important and powerful actors across the world, going back to the 85% and so on and so forth, inevitably these states will want to some extent, some more, some less, and so on, draw on this incredible resource. But what I also argue and try to show in the book, that as states do that, they will approach religion in their very specific and some often parochial ways. Not just the US, but any state. I mean, the debate in Italy is all about how are we going to tap into the resources of the Catholic Church to empower our diplomacy. Why? Because, of course, we don't have to even go into it, because that's the Italian history. Likewise, in the UK, it's, of course, the Anglican Church, together with Muslim communities around the world that are Pakistan, that are linked to the former British Empire, and so on. So I think it's very important, to one extent, absolutely recognizing the fundamental role of religion in societies and in providing security for human beings and well-being. At the same time, I think it's another thing, the entanglements between state foreign policy and these religious actors. And I think here, it's not necessarily more or less problematic, is just that other dynamics come, I think, I would argue, come into play.
Can I add one? Just, I'm going to take one example. I think we get into important but very tricky territory when we talk about the moral leadership and the ethical foundations which are equated with religious traditions. But I'm just going to give you one example, which is the foundation of Transparency International, which was created to fight corruption globally. And in the early years of Transparency International, they deliberately avoided having a moral focus in the effort, saying that it was much too complicated, got into all sorts of divisive territory, that it was much better to focus on technical, really very quantitative aspects. But over time, and Hans Küng has been one who's been pushing them on this, they've come to think that if you don't have the ethical conversation, which means in part linking into the religious networks and communities, which is still at a very early stage, you're not going to be able to deal with what some Gallup polls say is the leading issue of conversation in societies across the world, which is the problem of corruption. But I think that's an interesting journey that they've sort of moved much more towards a willingness. And we're seeing, I think, the same thing on environment. There's a sense that unless there is something that goes beyond the purely immediate and materialistic and into some appeal to broader values, that it's going to be very difficult to make much progress.
Science is not enough.
If I also might just add one brief point on this, just, so much of my work at the State Department did concern the intersection of religion and security, particularly around the set of ideas attached to the notion of countering violent extremism, and where religious actors and religious leaders fit into efforts to discredit the ideologies of groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And here I'm channeling very directly some incredibly insightful points made by Anel Sheline at Rice University in a piece she recently wrote, actually for the Berkley Center, called Declaration Proliferation, where she kind of looks rather skeptically at this parade of summits and declarations around peace and tolerance being organized by particularly a set of countries in the Arab Gulf region, featuring well-known religious scholars who gather together and after 3 days issue some statement about how, Islam is a religion of peace and people of different religions have to come together and work against this unified, work together in a unified way against the scourge of terrorism. And Anel in this piece points out that, and this is an error that I think both the Obama and the Trump administrations have made, which is in allowing governments like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to position themselves as kind of purveyors of moderate Islam and to kind of focus on the supposedly Islamic sources of terrorism, it allows them to displace blame for ills in their respective societies that are arguably more accurately analyzed as a function of absence of effective and accountable governance in the region, rather than as something to do with malignant interpretations of religion. So that in entertaining solutions cast in terms of moderate Islam, we're actually taking our eye off the actual source of the problem. And a sort of concomitant version of that I encountered very directly, when the Obama administration did its big, huge push on countering violent extremism, trying to make this a sort of global policy paradigm, was what you started to see was governments identifying any groups in society, including religious groups, that they saw as potential political opposition, and putting the label violent extremism or terrorism on that group, and then holding it up for the US to sort of applaud and pat them on the back for having, countered violent extremism, when in fact what we're doing is underwriting human rights violations, essentially. Who would like to enter the conversation? I think we still have time for a couple more questions. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Michael Che Kim. Been a federal bureaucrat, career bureaucrat for 12 years, and the last 5 as a Foreign Service officer. I'm with the U.S. Department of State. So one of the things I remember actually kind of inspired me to, as a Christian, to go into public service was right after 9/11 and listening to Dennis Ross, well-known Middle East negotiator, right after the attacks. It was St. Bartholomew's Church in Manhattan, and he was talking about his experiences, negotiating Palestine, and he noticed that the more religious members of both sides of the negotiating teams, whether Palestine or Orthodox Jews on Israel's side, they actually got along a lot better than their less religious members. His observation was because they respected and admired the passion of their belief. I mean, it was something they could recognize in each other, even though it wasn't the same religion. And I mentioned this in terms of the professor's presentation. I'm wondering, I'm very familiar with the post-modernity of the West, of the United States, Northern Hemisphere of Europe. And I'm wondering, in the research that you've done, a couple of things. Did you find in your research whether, or in the U.S. foreign policy community, a lack of, even among Christians, a lack of maybe feeling kind of shorthanded or unprepared when looking at certain overseas phenomena like Erdogan coming into power, Muslim, in Egypt, also the Muslim Brotherhood there. And I'm wondering also, do they see the influence, in my opinion, in the Southern Hemisphere, it's becoming more, and in developing countries, there's more and more influence of religious communities. So did that ever come up in terms of your discussions with practitioners? And with Professor Katherine Marshall, I'm wondering in terms of, the Catholic Church is a very large charitable organization. And do they have, what kind of relationship do they have with the World Bank and with the international donor community? And also there's a lot of Protestant organizations as well, World Vision, Samaritan's Purse. And I would think also there are Muslim organizations as well, whether some are considered acceptable by the international community, or organizations, I guess, like Hamas or other type, or even Muslim communities setting up madrasas, very known for also helping communities at a very microscopic level. How has the World Bank been looking in terms of religious organization that is involved in education of children, in terms of healthcare, especially in developing countries? Thank you.
Let me take one more question in the back before we turn back to Gregorio and Katherine for final responses.
Hi, my name is Omar Nassimi. I'm a grad student at George Mason University in religious studies. I missed the beginning, so I don't know if this may have been addressed, but I wanted to push back a little bit on the kind of framework and terminology that's kind of being pushed here, in the sense that what are we actually talking about in terms of what has the U.S. foreign policy done to create some of this terrorism that we talk about, especially on the side of what we call religious violence. In particular, I'm from Afghanistan, and much of what has happened in the last 20 years can be attributed to the US's involvement in the 90s and the way that they kind of left the situation. And then even after that, the way that they invaded, and then there's been a lot of foreign policy mistakes that then kind of get attributed to terrorism or extremism that happened because of poverty, and that happened because of people who are left with no real conditions of survival, that they then try to, these kinds of what we call extremism. One man's terrorist sometimes is another man's freedom fighter who has no other means of survival. So I just wanted to see if there's any kind of addressing of that phenomenon.
Thank you very much. So, Katherine, do you want to respond first to the question that was asked to you, and then we'll give the final word to our guest?
This is another 2-hour lecture, Ben. I think that the fundamental way that the international development community, and I'm in linking with the United Nations system, the multilateral banks, a lot of the secular NGOs, that religion is part of the problem and part of the solution. And the part of the problem, I think we all know, but for example, it came out very much in the AIDS crisis with the equation of encouraging stigma by basically equating HIV/AIDS with sin. And many other areas, including, of course, the area of violence. But the positive side is the long, long history of compassion, caring, the remarkable work of religious organizations at the community levels all over the world, as well as the big organizations, Caritas, World Vision, Islamic Relief, etc. The ways in which they are linked, I have a count of about 40 different networks that are basically trying to bring these voices, these experiences, knowledge into some of the policy, but also the operational discourse. Part of it is really part of the sort of civil society, and therefore is subject to the problem we're all worried about, which is shrinking civil society space. But certainly within the UN agency, a significant part of the organizations that have status within the United Nations have a religious link, either historically or presently. And there is a specific group within the UN, which is the religious NGOs, which meets and which has certain kinds of positions, et cetera. In the World Bank is the same. Last week during the annual meetings, there were 2 meetings. One was within the World Bank space itself with the senior leadership, and another was within the Civil Society Forum. On the other hand, coming back to my original point, it's a tiny fraction of what's happened. In other words, there's no way that anyone would want to argue that this is dominating. And these are tiny fractions of the financial resources that are going into these areas. But whether that's a good or a bad thing is something we really need to reflect on. Does it deserve a larger space? I mean, I think certainly on 2 topics, education and health, that there is a really very immediate need for a more thoughtful engagement on exactly how religious actors are involved in 2 very critical global challenges. And there's a lot more to do there.
Okay, well, thank you. Although I think you are very well positioned as well to answer some of these questions, maybe even better than me in terms of the State Department. Let me try to summarize some thoughts that I jotted down while I was hearing the 2 questions. I think one thing is what Katherine also mentioned earlier in terms of religious literacy, or just being aware that religion matters in world politics, about religious trends and dynamics and organizations, and that they have a very important role in shaping what people do and how they believe and so on, right? So the idea that we don't look at religion and we sort of blind to the Iranian Revolution and so on, some of these arguments there. Now, of course, rightly so, as alluded to also with the Afghanistan point is, I mean, we can explain Osama bin Laden perfectly without bringing in Islam, right? And some would argue, no, it's impossible, you have to bring Islam. But nonetheless, the point being is, I would argue that we do have to bring in Islam in a way or another, even to say that it has nothing to do with Islam, maybe, in the equation. So an understanding of religious dynamics in world politics, I think it's key. And the actors and so on. The same way that we have an understanding of economic dynamics, the same way we have an understanding of the history and culture of different places. Now, I think what are we going to do with that understanding is key. And I think, and here I would argue, we should not be, we should. So if we decide to engage in a way or another with these variety of religious dynamics and actors in the world, especially as a very powerful state like the US, but many other also Western, the European states are very powerful and so on. Well, there are power dynamics that are created. There is legitimacy that is granted to some and not to others. There is money that is given to some and not to others. There are some people that are invited to the table, not to others, and so on. And we should not have any illusion that that's not the case. Even if we have all the good intentions of the world. And of course, I think, who would say, no, I don't want a religious freedom, I don't like religious freedom, or better extremist violent Islam than a more peaceful, nobody, right? But we should not, I think we should not be, we should recognize that as we are trying to promote religious freedom, find moderate Muslims, engage religious actors for a two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so on, certain religious actors are, again, privileged, endorsed, and empowered over others. Now, once we have that understanding, we may say, well, yes, fine, great, let's do it, because that's what's our national interest, and that's what our values are, and these could reflect it. But I think we should not say, well, we're not really doing that, it's just something, and so on and so forth. I think, and so that's why when you bring in the state, you bring in politics, and that's inevitable. And it's part of the equation. And the other part, going to the Afghanistan point, it is one thing that I raise in the book, is we should be aware also of the unintended consequences. Now, for example, I'll bring in some examples. Yes, it's very important to many Christians, the state of Christians in the Middle East. But a lot of this attention that this receives in Western media, some Christians in the Middle East think, well, wait a minute, you're painting us with a sort of a fifth column in these societies as if we don't belong here, because then we are equated with Western actors, right? So again, good intentions, good. Let's call it good, nonetheless may lead to unintended consequence. So likewise the Mujahideen and so on, right? So they were religious, Charlie Wilson's war, right? They religious on the fight against godless communism, and then sort of turning back against the United States. So I think some of these unintended consequences, I think, have gone unexamined sometimes. And I think do deserve a little bit more attention, both scholarly and policy-wise, and so on. And so I'll leave it at that.
Just remains for me to thank all of you for being with us, for your patience as we run a few minutes over. If this is your first time at the Berkley Center and you're into this stuff, please do consider signing up for the center's listserv, because we dish it out in heaps. And so there's plenty more where this started. Most of all, let me thank Katherine and especially Gregorio for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.